Today, we're going to talk about a man who was so sure he would get away with his crimes. He even led a TV crew through his house to prove he wasn't a suspect. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. Let's get started. One morning in January of 2002, 12-year-old Ashley Pond was running late. She lived in Oregon City, Oregon with her mother in an apartment complex. So Ashley is running late to school, so obviously she's dashing out of the house and trying to make it to the bus stop. Ashley was a really intelligent and smart and sweet girl. She also loved to dance and was on the dance team, and her best friend actually lived in the same apartment complex, so they got to spend a lot of time together. The bus stop was only about a 10-minute walk from Ashley's apartment, but it turns out Ashley would never make it to the bus stop, and she would never make it to middle school that day. So obviously later that day, Ashley's mother, Lori Pond, realized something was up. Her daughter never returned home from school. I'm sure Lori was terrified, so she started looking for her daughter. She probably went next door and asked Ashley's friend Miranda if they had been together, if she had seen her, and then she called the police. And initially, police suspected that the 12-year-old girl had run away. Obviously, police came to the apartment, but they didn't search the complex at all that evening. In fact, they were positive that she was a runaway, but Lori Pond wouldn't hear it. Lori was getting frustrated at this point. She's asking them what 12-year-old would run away. She has no reason to run away. She's happy. She's on the dance team. Things are going really well for her. And then the next morning, the police department finally assigned a detective to the case, and they waited 9 days before calling the FBI in. Of course, this outraged the community. So obviously, now this is turning into a missing child's case. The FBI is involved, local police are involved, the search kicks up, but no clues actually surfaced. It's like Ashley just disappeared into thin air. And because she was popular at school and she was on the swim team and the dance team, Lori firmly believed that her daughter did not run away, and the community felt the same. The problem was, once police started this investigation, they had at least 90 offenders living in that complex alone. So this apartment complex wasn't an upscale apartment complex. It had a lot of mentally ill people that were often placed there by the county, had sex offenders, people released on parole. It really wasn't the safest of environments. And one of those suspects was actually Ashley's father himself. He had actually been convicted of sexually abusing her during one of their visits. So obviously people questioned, did he take her? And where was she? Did he still have her? But eventually he was ruled out. So weeks passed, and obviously this is a big case. There's a lot of news coverage. This little girl was just walking to the bus stop and she up and vanished. And there were no clues. Her book bag hadn't been left behind. Her books weren't scattered. She just disappeared and nobody had seen anything. And then one day, Ashley's best friend who lived in the apartment complex, Miranda, was interviewed by a TV reporter.
It's really hard to believe that having one of your friends or something, it's just really different and really sad.
And then in the following weeks, obviously the task force was chasing down leads and they were really trying to find Ashley, and they had high hopes that she was still okay. They even began tailing some of the neighbors in the apartment complex. They were suspects. They watched Ashley's mother and her mother's boyfriend. They really wanted to find out what happened to Ashley. And then something sinister happened 2 months later. Miranda, Ashley's best friend, who had appeared on TV, went missing. Not only was she Ashley's best friend, but she was also on the dance team, and they vanished within 8 weeks of each other. And this caused absolute panic. People were terrified. Two girls, the same apartment complex, they were friends, they were on the dance team together, they had sleepovers with other girls in the apartment complex, went missing. Obviously, people feared a serial predator was on the loose. So the FBI actually ramped up their investigation. They really had a feeling that these two cases were directly related. Soon, more than 60 people were actually working on these two cases. And then luckily, a private investigator that was actually part of the extended family of Ashley Pons decided to take the case. Obviously, although she was extended family, she knew the young girl. And when Miranda went missing, she knew she had to do something. So Linda O'Neill began turning down other cases so that she could focus primarily on this one. So when P.I. O'Neill got involved in the case, she had a lot of work to do. The FBI basically said, we have no suspects. We don't even know if we have a crime because there's no evidence of that. Two girls just went up and missing. So many people on the suspect list had committed crimes prior to these incidents. One neighbor had a restraining order placed against him by his ex-girlfriend because he was violent. Miranda's own father was convicted of abusing two minor girls. Ashley's father stepmother had been accused of abusing her, and within a mile of their apartment complex was a whole host of sex offenders. So O'Neill started by asking her family who is in Ashley's everyday life, and that's when she came across an interesting name. Ward Weaver III was a neighbor and kind of a friend to the family. His home was actually right next to the apartment complex that Ashley lived in, and he had been interviewed on television too. He was a single father raising a daughter, and his daughter was actually friends with both Miranda and Ashley. In the interview he did on TV, he would talk about how all the dance girls would come over and they would spread out on the floor, and you couldn't walk around his house without obviously stepping on a body because they were having a big sleepover.
You could not walk anywhere in my front room without stepping on a body.
So he was well known within the families. But police had already checked his alibi and had brought search dogs onto his property, and he allowed it. He wasn't concerned at all. So they really ruled him out as a suspect. So O'Neill, still a little bit cautious about Ward Weaver, decided to look into his background. And when she did, she found out that he was on death row. So she paused, she thought it through, and then she realized that that was Ward Weaver III's father. His father was actually on death row, and he was on death row for serial murder. So Ward Weaver III kind of grew up in a really turbulent environment. Obviously, his father was convicted in a double murder, and his sister later would say that he actually sexually and physically abused a family member by the age of 12. He was 12 years old when he committed that crime. And when a victim who was in his own family came forward and claimed that he had raped her, prosecution didn't actually press charges because they didn't feel that they had enough evidence. And he had been enlisted in the armed forces, so he'd be leaving Portland anyways. He'd actually be discharged from the armed forces because of his alcoholism, so he was excessively drinking all the time. Eventually, he met a woman, she got pregnant, they moved in with his parents, and when she was about 5 months pregnant, he actually physically assaulted her, but she wouldn't press charges against him. It was later determined that that pregnancy, his son, wasn't actually his biological son. So actually his father in 1981 murdered a young couple whose car broke down in California. He actually buried the bodies in his backyard and was caught and sentenced to death. In 1986, Weaver had actually moved his family to California. During that time, he attacked a teenager who was a daughter of one of his friends. He actually hit the girl with a block of concrete, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for that assault. After spending time in prison, him and his wife moved to Oregon, where they owned and operated a shop. Eventually, she would file a restraining order against him because he was so violent, and then filed for divorce. And then in July of 1995, Weaver had a new girlfriend whom he beat with a cast iron skillet. If you don't know what a cast iron skillet is, it's a very heavy pan and it's made out of iron. They're very heavy to hold, they're great for cooking, but being hit by one of those could do some serious damage to somebody. He was actually jailed for that incident, but his wife refused to testify against him. By October of that year, they were back together, and they lasted for 4 more years. So obviously discovering all of these things about Ward Weaver III probably made O'Neill focus significantly more on him. He had a history of violence, and just because he was a single father raising a daughter and had allowed people on his property to search for the girls doesn't mean he wasn't up to anything. And then a second PI offered to help O'Neill. So Harry Oakes got involved, but many police departments didn't like him, and I'm sure it's because he's a maverick. When he's on the trail of something, he's on the trail of something. And the police warned the family against using him, but he waived his fee and got to work. And I'm not sure how things are today, but I know there's been a lot of issues with police departments and PIs because they feel like PIs are stomping on their grounds or maybe even hindering their work. Oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes PIs are trying to contribute to the case and they take information to the police, information police should be checking into. And that's really important if a case has stalled, as was Ashley Pond's disappearance and now Miranda's. So he actually brought in his search and rescue dog, gave it some of Ashley's clothing, and followed it. The dog led from the apartment complex, up the road, up a staircase, and right to Ward Weaver's property. And they literally went up to his door and knocked on it and asked if they could search his house. And they were surprised when Weaver said, "I don't have any problem with you searching. They've already brought in 7 different search dogs and teams. I have nothing to hide." But during the search of that house, the dog gave his commander, Harry, an alert to death. The dog actually alerted outside of the house on the property to a concrete slab. So obviously Oakes made a report and turned it into the police department. And this was less than 2 weeks after Miranda's disappearance. It was about March 20th. And instead of viewing the report and taking it serious, police pretty much ignored it. And when Linda learned of the report, something stood out to her. She had done some background information, and remember, she found out about Ward Weaver's father. And when he murdered that young couple, he buried them in his own backyard. This sent chills down her spine. And then some really scary information came out. Over the next few weeks, people would begin to talk to O'Neill. There's a teacher who saw Weaver drop Ashley off at school, which wouldn't make much sense because he's not her parent and there's no reason for him to be doing that. Somebody saw a man in his late 30s locked in a kiss with Ashley. And there's a family friend who said Ashley spent weeks at Weaver's house, often sleeping in bed next to him. There's also an ex-girlfriend who said that Ward Weaver was actually very upset with Miranda, the second child to go missing, because she would tell neighborhood girls to stay away from his house because he might molest you, which means Miranda probably knew a bit more than she had told anyone. By June, it had been 6 months since Ashley went missing and 3 months for Miranda. And that private detective, Linda O'Neill, came home one day with a shocking discovery. She came face to face with Ward Weaver. When she came home, her son was working on his car with Ward Weaver. Of course, I'm sure this sent her into a panic. And what he said to Linda O'Neill left me in chills. He said, "Kids are so naive, aren't they?" And she said to him, "Mr. Weaver, I don't think my family is any of your business." And he said, "That's what I came here to tell you." And this terrified her. She actually dug out her gun, she loaded it, and she placed it in her purse. She firmly believed he was capable of hurting her or her family. So the FBI dispatched canines again to sniff around the complex, but they didn't detect anything. So they basically said, hey, we have no suspects and we have no clues. And obviously, this upset the PIs. O'Neill told them, you need to focus on this 39-year-old single father who lived in a house near the apartments. Something was not right there. And she worried another child was going to be hurt. And when she reached out to the FBI, they were basically like, hey, we're the FBI, we don't need help from a PI, even though she was a well-recognized PI. And this made her so angry that she actually reached out to a reporter. So she contacted Jim Redden, and they came up with a plan. They were going to surprise Weaver at his home. So they got up early one Sunday morning, drove to Weaver's home, knocked on his door, and he answered. And Ward Weaver invited them in for an interview. He did not shy away from the press whatsoever. He wanted to prove that he should not be a suspect whatsoever. And I'm going to show you parts of the interview, and it is chilling.
See, we were on to Ward Weaver based on a tip we received about the bushy-haired neighbor at the top of the hill. And it wouldn't take long in the course of this conversation to learn why.
They are hassling my family, my friends. They are saying that I am the #1 suspect.
He told me he flunked 2 polygraph tests, but also walked me through his home to show he had nothing to hide. A month later, I learned the truth. He was taunting me here.
The reporter would go on to say later that he really did seem like a normal guy, but the more he talked, it seemed like the more nervous he got. At one point, he even mentioned that he was the prime suspect. The FBI was looking into him, and the reporter would even say that he came across as an honest person. And he even told O'Neill he seems like an okay guy. And O'Neill kind of looked at him like, I am certainly not the crazy one in this situation. She had that gut feeling that he was responsible for this crime. But the reporter actually wrote the article anyways, and that put Ward Weaver's name in print for the very first time since the disappearance of Ashley Pond. And he was now the center of attention. He was the prime suspect, and he seemed to be enjoying the attention, and you can see that in the interviews conducted. He even went on national television and said that she's better off hiding out wherever she's found a place to live. So what did police do? Just a few days after that article came out, police went on this huge raid. They searched a house, they towed away cars and all of that stuff, but it wasn't at Ward Weaver's house. It was another prime suspect on their list, another neighbor. So they got this article out, and Ward Weaver is listed, and they go and execute a search warrant on their other suspect's place. It just seems like utter insanity to me. By August, 7 months had passed, and they were still no closer to making an arrest. Still nothing had changed for Ward Weaver. They didn't do any search warrants. They hadn't done anything, and he would tell anybody who would listen that he was this prime suspect. He would literally boast about it, that they thought he was the prime suspect of the case. But by early August, apparently Ward Weaver had had enough media attention. He told people that he was emptying his house and he was moving to either Mexico or Idaho. So with his house house empty and him preparing to move, he did something that still mystifies people to this day.
Ward Weaver says he is fed up with investigators hassling him and now plans to move out of state, perhaps to Mexico.
I'm going to go check, a couple places out and see what's got the best chances for jobs, and I'm out of here.
K2 News again asks if he has any idea where Ashley and Miranda are.
None. I'd like to know where both of them are. I'd like to see Miranda come home. Ashley, I'd like to know where she's at, but honestly, I'd leave her there.
In August of 2002, Ward Weaver's son had a girlfriend, and they had a child together. Oneida got in the car with Ward Weaver, assuming he was somebody she could trust. After all, her child called him grandpa. That was her father-in-law for all intensive purposes. When they got to Ward Weaver's house, he attacked her and viciously sexually assaulted her. She would later go on to say that he looked possessed, that it wasn't him, that it was Satan inside of him, and that the second he stood up and got off of her, he went back to looking completely normal. And she pushed him with her feet. She got up and she ran out of there. She wasn't clothed. She grabbed a tarp that was covering the concrete slab, wrapped it around her, and just ran as fast as she could. She was shaking. She flagged down a car and told them what happened. He was arrested, booked, and placed in jail on charges of rape. So obviously a search was conducted on the property because of the assault. And many people at this point were questioning what the FBI was waiting for. He just violently attacked his son's girlfriend. Eventually, protesters began to gather at his property and protest the fact that police weren't doing anything. And then finally, the FBI showed up in force on August 23rd, bringing dozens of agents, 2 white tents, and a bunch of equipment. And hours later, they made their first discovery. In a shed behind the house, they found a box. And in that box, they found human remains. And those remains were identified as Miranda's. Following day, everybody was holding a vigil for Miranda. Investigators were on site. They were digging up that concrete. And that's when they found Ashley Pond's body. And Ward Weaver never actually went on to tell people why he did it. In fact, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. And really, if it wasn't for his son's girlfriend, Randy Oneida, I'm not sure the FBI would have taken this seriously and started to investigate his property and get a search warrant to do so. This 19-year-old really was the reason the search warrant even happened. And really, I firmly believe if Randy hadn't acted quickly and kicked him and gotten up and booked it out of that house, she would have also been another murder victim. Linda O'Neill actually co-authored a book called Missing the Oregon City Girls. I haven't read it yet, but I'm really excited to get my hands on a copy of it. So I'll keep everybody updated once I do and I work my way through it. But it really outlines her investigation during this time. After Ward Weaver was arrested for the rape of his daughter-in-law, his son actually came forward with incriminating evidence. He told them that he helped him dig a hole and then filled it with concrete because he was going to put a hot tub in. So 10 days after his arrest, this gave them quote unquote probable cause to search the property. What's really incredible about this case is 10 years after, Mariah, who was Miranda's sister, went to prison and visited Ward Weaver. She wanted to know why he had done that to her sister and to Ashley. He had taken a significant part of her life from her, and nobody knew what happened to Ashley and Miranda. He was very tight-lipped about it. And when he told Mariah what happened, it was shocking. So Mariah goes to this prison and she's questioning Ward Weaver, and he tells her what happened. He told Mariah that he thought Miranda saw something he was doing as she was walking up the hill to the school bus. He got scared and he panicked. I'm not sure what he was doing or what he said he was doing, but we can assume it was not good. So he said, hey, Miranda, Ashley's inside. Ashley wants to come home, but she's scared. So Miranda went over there and he preyed on this idea that this 13-year-old would go in there and help her 12-year-old friend come back home. And he even told her that he killed Ashley Pond because he was terrified he was going to be arrested for raping her. And in the footage, you will see Ward Weaver not only walk over the concrete slab that he had put on top of Ashley Pond's body, but he also stood in front of a freezer during the interview. And that freezer he had used to store Miranda's body in. He was calculated, he was cold, and he was much like his father. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. See you next time.